What inspired you to publicize the possibilities of a settlement on Mars, and how do you think this will affect the rate of progress for the plans for Mars?
Well, I got inspired to be interested in space travel by Sputnik, which occurred when I was a little boy, and that told me that space travel was going to become possible, it was going to be the future, and I learned science to become part of it. But in terms of my own particular plans, in 1989, by then I was already an engineer working at Martin Marietta, a company, big aerospace company. It's now Lockheed Martin. And President Bush, the older President Bush, on the 20th anniversary of the moon landing, gave a speech at the National Air and Space Museum. He had Armstrong and Aldrin and Collins, the Apollo 11 crew, sitting right behind him. He said, "This is the 20th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing. That's what America's all about, and therefore I am president of committing us to go back to the moon and on to Mars, and it's time to stay." It's great, okay? But then NASA went off, and Bush asked them to design a plan to do it. And they designed the most complicated plan they possibly could. It would take 30 years before we got to Mars. And before we did it, we had to build a gigantic space station, much bigger than the space station we actually have now, as well as space stations going around the moon, lunar bases, all sorts of things, refueling stations in space, you name it. And it was this incredibly expensive plan. It was going to take 30 years. It was obviously no way Congress was going to fund this. There was obviously no way Americans are going to wait 30 years to get something that they want. But I and some other engineers at Martin looked at this and said, this is a ridiculous plan. You don't need all this stuff. They're just inserting all these things in the plan to make them look like they're necessary so they could get them all funded. In other words, they were using the Mars mission kind of like a Christmas tree to hang the ornaments on to display all the different ornaments that you have in the box. Okay, but the idea of a Mars mission is not to use all the ornaments that it can. The idea of the right design is not the most expensive design, it's the cheapest design. How do we get to Mars direct? And we set ourselves to thinking about this, and we came up with a plan, which called Mars Direct, which I laid out in great length in the book, The Case for Mars, in which it was quite clear that we could get to Mars for a tenth of the cost that NASA was talking about in a third the time. And if we took a more rational approach and made maximum use of the materials that were there to be found on Mars, and you can make your return fuel and oxygen on Mars instead of having to drag it all with you and so forth. And it was very clear that unless someone put a plan like this forward, there wasn't going to be a program at all. And we went to management of the Martin Company. We said, look, I know you guys don't like to contradict the customer, NASA, because they don't like it when people disagree with them. But unless somebody says something rational here, there's not going to be a program. Okay, if the price tag for humans to Mars is $400 billion, there's no trip to Mars. Okay, it's got to be tens of billions, not hundreds of billions, at most. And they actually agreed with that, so they let us publish. And we did, and in fact, we went to the primary NASA centers, and we got a very interesting response, because I thought that the people there would just tell us to shove off, okay? But it turned out there were a great number of people in NASA that were very unhappy with the situation, who knew there had to be a better way than what was in the 98 report. See, it wasn't that the 98 report was the report with the most complicated Mars plan you could possibly imagine. And the reason why it was that way is not because of some kind of conspiracy, but because you had all these people show up to the design committee saying, we want you to include our technology program in your mission plan, or you'll make us look unnecessary. And the people coordinating that study were not willing to say no to anybody. So they included them all. And they designed the most complicated mission they possibly could in order to make everyone's technology be mission critical. But that's not the right way to do engineering. So when we proposed this, we actually found a lot of support. Okay, at the various NASA centers, the National Marshall Space, the Johnson Space Center, Jet, Propulsion, Langdon, etc. And then, yes, there was a counterattack from people who were very unhappy because we weren't including their technologies in our plan. So it became controversial right from the start. But in 1994 was the 25th anniversary of the moon landing. So we've just lived through the 20th, through the 50th, right? When you saw all the celebrations and hullabaloo. Well, it was similar at the 25th, okay? Except that Newsweek magazine, which at that time was a big magazine, it's kind of hit hard times since then, but at that time it was where it was at. It ran a cover story. It's the 25th anniversary of Apollo. Shouldn't we go beyond the moon? Where should we set our sights? Where next? There's a plan. It's called Mars Direct. Let's make our Apollo mission humans to Mars. And that got around and it kind of shook things up. It's from that I got invited to write the book, The Case for Mars. That has put the plan forward ever since. So unfortunately, it still got sidetracked through various political reasons. But here we are at the 50th anniversary now. And really, okay, the Trump administration is saying, well, we should be that as good as we were. Let's go back to the moon. We can be there in 5 years. And I think we certainly can be back at the moon in 5 years. Okay, I mean, 5 years from now is like 1964 compared to 1969, and we're far more capable today of flying to the moon than we were in 1964. But I think that's thinking too small, because I don't think we can inspire people of your generation with the goal of repeating something that their grandparents did. Okay, you know, I mean, I think we need to go beyond that. I mean, I think the equivalent today of humans to the moon in the 1960s is not humans to the moon in the 2020s, it's humans to Mars in the 2020s. And I think that's a goal we can do. And I think it's a challenge we should accept. As Kennedy said when he launched the moon program, we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
So this morning we listened to Dr. Valerie Rapson talk about humans on Mars and the negative effects that the life on Mars could have on the humans. And so I just want to know, in your opinion, what even makes going to Mars worth it?
Well, I can think of a number of reasons to go to Mars. For the science, for the challenge, and for what it'll do to the future, and what it does for the vision, our vision of the future. Okay, first of all, in terms of the science, it's a question of discovering the truth about the true nature of life, its potential prevalence and diversity in the universe. You know, early Earth and Mars were twins. Mars was a warming white planet 3.5 billion years ago when life first appeared on Earth. They were not dissimilar. And they both had carbon dioxide atmospheres, liquid water, similar minerals. So the question is, did life also originate on Mars? Now, and really it's a question of, did life originate on Earth, or was it seeded from the outside? So in other words, I think there's a high probability that we'll discover, at a minimum, evidence of past life on Mars, if not life that's continuing to persist in subsurface groundwater. But the question then becomes, what form is that life? If Earth was seeded from the outside by microbes, spores of interstellar origin, then Mars would have been too. In which case, we would find life on Mars of a similar type, that is, using RNA and DNA as all Earth life does. All Earth life, when you're talking about bacteria, mushrooms, crocodiles, or people, they all use the same genetic alphabet. Mm-hmm. Okay, they all use the Latin alphabet. Okay, does life on Mars use the Latin alphabet or the Chinese alphabet? Okay, because there's more than one kind of alphabet possible in language, and conceivably there's many more than one type of genetic alphabet possible for life. So is life as we know it on Earth what life is? Or is it just one example drawn from a much vaster tapestry of possibilities? And if we could see what some of those other possibilities are, I mean, what is life but self-replicating micro machines. It has tremendous power. It has remade the Earth. It has put oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. It has the power to transform planets and, of course, to create all sorts of complex organisms and so on. If we could find out something more about what's the possibilities of life are, this would give us tremendous powers of medicine and even geoengineering. So these are not only philosophically something that thinking men and women have wondered about for thousands of years. From a practical point of view, this is of immense importance. And then just briefly, some of these other reasons for the challenge, I think Humans to Mars program would be a tremendous productive challenge, particularly to the youth of every society that's participating. And say to people like you, learn your science and you could be an explorer of new worlds. Now, that's what the Moon program said to me when I was a boy. And to many of my generation, we doubled our science graduates in the United States in the 1960s precisely because of that, because as you know, what does youth really love? Adventure. And bold space program makes science the great adventure. And the benefits we've gotten from the space program have not only been the technologies that NASA and its contractors have made, which include things like solar panels, which are very important, but the intellectual capital that it has developed. And I mean, who were the people that created this whole computer revolution that is now pervasive in our society? It was created in the 1990s by 40-year-olds, technological entrepreneurs who were 10-year-old little boy mad scientists making rocket fuel and robots in the basement in the 1960s. The benefits of that economic have vastly exceeded the cost of the Moon program. Mm-hmm. Okay, then there's the future. I mean, really, what do you think people 500 years from now are going to think is important and that's going on in the world today? You think they're going to care about Brexit or which gang of murderers took power in Syria or who was in or who was out? No, what they're going to care about is how we made their civilization possible. Okay, this interstellar civilization of humanity on thousands of planets orbiting thousands of stars, because that's where this goes. Mm-hmm. Mars is not the destination. Mars is the direction. Right. If we establish that first human foothold on Mars, there will not only be new branches of human civilization on Mars, there will be on multitudes of worlds beyond. New civilizations, new cultures, new languages, new literatures, new traditions, new contributions to technology and invention and science, new histories of epic deeds that will inspire people to go further. You know, this is something vast, great, and wonderful that we can make possible. And if you have it in your power to do something vast, great, and wonderful, then you should.
I agree. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Jackie. Jackie?
Hello, Dr. Zubrin. I have a question in regards to plants and animals on Mars. My question is, what do you think is the possibility that we can alter the atmosphere of Mars so that way it can support the life of certain living organisms such as plants and animals that are here on Earth? Like, is it possible that we could save certain endangered species by sending them to Mars? And if we do so, would we have to change the DNA? Would we have to change or alter the DNA or RNA of plants and animals in order to be able to send them to Mars? And when do you think this could happen?
Well, okay, the first human explorers to go to Mars will live in enclosed habitats. Like the spacecraft that they land on Mars in will be their house. Then we'll probably dig underground vaults, and we'll have habitations the size of subway systems, and we'll build surface domes for greenhouses to grow plants. But eventually, once there's enough people on Mars, and they have significant industrial capability on Mars, I think we will start to alter Mars itself, okay, to make Mars more habitable. Because, you know, Mars was once a warm and wet planet. And I think it could be made so again through human engineering. I believe the key is to warm the planet. We know how to warm the planet. We have been showing that here on Earth. But if we wanted to do it on purpose, there are greenhouse gases that we can produce that are far more potent than carbon dioxide. And these are the fluorocarbon gases, which in fact we do make on Earth right now. We use them as refrigerants. And if we made them on Mars not for putting in refrigerators and air conditioners, but to release into the atmosphere for the purpose of warming the planet, and if we did it on the same scale we're currently doing on Earth for these and related compounds, we could warm the planet by 10 centigrade in 50 years. That's a lot. Since 1880, the human global warming on Earth has only been about 1 centigrade, so this is 10 times that much, and in 1/3 the time. And that would have profound effects. That would cause massive amounts of carbon dioxide that's currently soaked into the soil to outgas and thicken the atmosphere. And of course, CO2 is, as we know, a greenhouse gas, and this would be a lot of it, much more than we're releasing on Earth. And that would warm the planet even more. And as it does, there's water on Mars. It's frozen right now because it's so cold, but it would now melt. And these glaciers that we have found on Mars, the permafrost, the water frozen into the soil, the vast continents of frozen mud would melt out, and the dry streams of Mars would start to flow again. The dry rivers would flow, the dry lakes would fill up, the dry oceans would fill up, and there would be rain. And at that point, you could start spreading plants around on Mars. And they would start turning some of that CO2 into oxygen, at which point animals, starting with simple animals, then insects, and eventually though mammals and such, would be able to breathe the air. And we can take Mars and turn it from a world which is either dead or nearly dead. I think there might be microbes underground on Mars and subsurface heated groundwater, but there's no life on the surface of Mars. We can make Mars a living planet like the Earth, at which point, look, when humans go to Mars, we're going to bring some animals with us. We're going to bring dogs and cats because we like them. We're going to bring other kinds of animals because they're part of our agricultural economy. But from honeybees to goats. But but eventually, when it becomes a fully living planet, all sorts of animals will be introduced on Mars, and plants, of course, and they will change because Mars, even when we terraform it, will always be somewhat different than the Earth because, for instance, it will always have 1/3 gravity. So when you bring an animal or a plant into a new environment, it starts readapting to be the best it can be for that environment. So this is how new species are created. So if we want to save endangered species on Earth, we need to save endangered species on Earth, okay? But if we want to help create new species, new multitudes of plants and animals, bring them to a new world, and let them get a new start.
So my question is, what are the practical implications of establishing and sustaining life on Mars? So in other words, what key elements are necessary to establish and sustain life?
Okay. If we want to sustain, develop, and expand life on Mars, okay, we need to be able to turn local materials into resources. See, I don't believe with people who say that there is so much raw materials, natural resources in the world, rather. I don't think there's any such thing as a natural resource. I think there's only natural raw materials. And it is resourceful people who turn raw materials into resources. Okay? If you can create resources in the environment in which you live, then you can sustain yourself and you can do more than sustain yourself. You can prosper, you can expand. And look, we've got forests here in upstate New York, right? Just like we do in Colorado. Different plants, but the same general kind of thing. Two people can be stranded in the woods, and one could starve to death in 3 weeks, and the other could live there indefinitely in relative comfort. Why? Because to one, the potential resources of the forest are invisible, and to the other they are apparent. So we need to go to Mars with the attitude that we're going to create resources there for ourselves. Okay. So, for instance, water. Okay. We'll obviously bring a certain amount of water with us, but we need more than anything we can bring. We'll want to be able to extract water from the Martian soil, okay, because it's there. We'll want to be able to take carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere, and first of all, just acquire it and use it to support greenhouses. Plants can use carbon dioxide and water to grow, so now we're making food on Mars. But also, with certain kinds of chemical reactors, we can take carbon dioxide and water and react them to produce fuels and oxygen. So now we've got food, we've got fuel, we've got oxygen. We're going to want to make steel on Mars. That should be possible. Mars is red. Why? Because of rust, iron oxide. Well, we need to be able to take that iron oxide and reduce it into iron or steel and oxygen. We can do that too. What about power? That's a little harder. Well, there's some solar power we can generate on Mars, but it's not as attractive as the Earth because it's further from the sun. And the air is too thin to get much power out of the wind. But Mars probably has geothermal heat underground. We can access that. We can create geothermal power. Mars has got deuterium. It's got 5 times as much deuterium on Mars as there is on Earth. And deuterium is the key fuel for fusion reactors. Well, we don't have fusion reactors right now. We need to create them in order to be able to use this immense resource, immense potential resource that Mars has. So if we take this approach of creating resources, we need to be creative, okay? The future belongs to the creative because it's the creative that create the future.
So why Mars and not any other planets or moons?
Well, the reason why Mars should be our goal is because Mars is the closest world that has on it all the elements needed to support life and therefore civilization. The moon is closer, that's quite true, obviously, but the moon is much poorer, okay? Okay, there's only a little bit of water on the moon in permanently shadowed craters near the South Pole. There's quite literally oceans of water on Mars. There's continent-sized regions on Mars where the soil is 60% water by weight. There are glaciers on Mars as far south as 38 degrees north, which is the latitude of San Francisco. And these glaciers are immense. They contain more water than the American Great Lakes. Okay, and they're nearly pure water ice. They're not visible to telescopes, but we found them using ground-penetrating radar on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. They're only covered by a few feet of dust. They're within shovel distance of the surface. So there's water. That's a critical resource for civilization and life. Carbon. We're carbon-based life forms. We're made of carbon and water. Okay, and everything we use is made of carbon. Everything we wear is made of carbon. Everything we eat is made of carbon. And almost everything else, even steel, is not made of carbon, but it's made with the help of carbon. And plastics and all this, and wood. And so there's no carbon on the moon. Carbon dioxide is 95% of the Martian atmosphere, so there's plenty of carbon on Mars. There's no nitrogen on the moon. That's also essential for life. Nitrogen is 3% of the Martian atmosphere. Mars has a 24-hour day, which is what we're used to on Earth, which is what plants like to grow, and they can photosynthesize in the day, respire at night. The moon is 2 weeks of light, 2 weeks of dark. Mars has an atmosphere that's thick enough to shield the surface against solar flares, so it can grow crops on the Martian surface in natural sunlight in thin-walled greenhouses. On the moon, any greenhouse on the surface would have to have glass like 5 inches thick to shield the plants from solar flares. That's not realistic. Mars has got a complex geological history. that the moon hasn't. And this is important because you take like copper. Okay, copper, people have used copper since ancient Egypt. Okay, but copper is actually a geochemically very rare element on the Earth. It's only easy for people to use because there's been natural geological processes that have concentrated it into concentrated mineral ore and even metallic deposits. Whereas on the moon, it's all just trash rock. So for all these reasons that it possesses the elements of life and all the elements of industry, the moon's missing about half of them, and the elements have been differentiated through complex geological processes, volcanism and water action, and even perhaps biological processes on Mars. That this is what makes Mars much more interesting. I mean, I think for the current age of space exploration, if we compare it to the European age of ocean exploration, Mars compares to the moon as North America compared to Greenland at that time. Greenland was closer to Europe. Europeans reached it first, but it was fundamentally a poorer environment. It wasn't a place where you could really create you could create outposts there, but not a fully developed human civilization. And that's why the goal should be Mars.
All right. Thank you very much.